This man rescued a bear cub. 20 years later, something incredible happened. This was the biggest bear that any of them had ever seen up close, and it was walking slowly toward the man in front of it. Its arms were stretched out, making the massive creature look even bigger. The man was standing perfectly still. He knew bears, and he knew this animal. Most of us would make a run for it upon the sight of such an animal coming straight at us. But Jim Kowalczyk had been working with bears and other wildlife for more than 20 years, and he knew how to react in pretty much any situation these animals could throw at him. Of course, wild animals and animals in general have a way of shocking us. They can do some unexpected things that we never see coming. And Jim knew this better than anyone. Fortunately, his wife had the same experience and felt the same way about animals. Susan had worked with wildlife her entire life. Rescue and rehabilitation were her passion, even when she couldn't do it full-time. The couple got their wildlife rehabilitation license early in their marriage. On their big piece of land, they started to care for animals of all sorts. Susan had a special place for one animal species in particular. She adored bears. She had worked with them before, and despite the potential risks associated with taking care of them, she was eager to give it a try. They set up their enclosures, and then they just had to wait for the call. It would happen quicker than they had imagined. They had given a home to a few bears from wildlife centers facing closure, understanding that while they couldn't rehabilitate the animals, they could provide a home. Susan and Jim were pleased to offer them refuge, but they remained eager for an animal requiring more intensive care to arrive. That opportunity came when an animal park phoned them about one of their female Kodiak bears that rejected one of her newly born cubs. The cub wasn't doing well. It had an injury on its leg. They weren't sure how it had gotten injured, but it seemed like the female didn't think it was going to make it. She had rejected the cub, and as a result, it was in serious danger. It wasn't eating, and a cub that small could dehydrate quickly. Without the protection of the mom, the other bears in the enclosure could injure the bear cub too. Jim and Susan sprang into action as fast as they could. The animals in the animal park were used to having people around, but they still could react defensively if someone tried to take away any of the babies out of their enclosure, even a rejected baby. Jim and Susan rushed to the animal park where the team was waiting for them. They headed towards the huge enclosure where the bears were held. In a zoo, they often had a space to separate animals, but this was out in the open. They had to go in while the bears were right there. Everyone's hearts were beating loudly. The cub they had come for had weakened in the last few hours, and he lay in the back without moving. They had to get to him right away. The park caretakers gave snacks to the adult bears in one corner of the enclosure, and Jim and some of the other park workers raced inside on a golf cart. Some of the adult bears looked up to see what the humans were up to. If things were going to go wrong, then this would be the moment. A few got closer and even stood on their back legs to investigate. But it was a relief to see them turning back. Luckily, they were more interested in the snacks at that moment than in the people inside their enclosure. Jim jumped out and grabbed the cub. He had on thick gloves and a jacket, just in case the baby bear would put up a fight. But when he picked up the cub, it was completely limp. The cub was not sleeping, but it was unconscious. They needed to get the poor animal help right away. They grabbed the bear and rushed it to the medical center in the park. It was very dehydrated, and they put it on IV fluids and helped get its statistics up. Jim held the cub as they waited for it to recover. His body heat and his heartbeat seemed to help the cub recover. The vets checked its injuries, cleaned them up, and set a cast on the damaged leg. When the cub was deemed strong enough by the vets, it was time for the cub to make the journey to the orphaned wildlife center. Jim held the bear cub while they took it home. It was tiny, the smallest cub they had ever worked with. The fluids helped the cub recover, and soon it was back on its feet, though still so young and limping. It was genuinely heart-wrenching to witness. The cub needed to be hand-fed for a while. It still needed milk, and they had a long road to get this cub to adulthood. It had to be treated with special care, as any newborn animal would. Normally, Susan and Jim would keep their distance and make sure the rescued animal didn't get too attached to them. Their biggest focus at the sanctuary was to rehabilitate animals and eventually release them back into the wild. They had rescued horses, deer, squirrels, and even bears. In the case of the wild animals, they would try to rehabilitate them and set them free. In most cases, the rescued animal's stay at the center was only temporary. Unfortunately, releasing this poor bear into the wild was never going to be an option. Born in captivity, both the cub and its mother shared a life confined. It became evident that the cub wouldn't thrive in the wild, and as it grew older, the lasting nature of its injury became increasingly apparent. That would make it even more difficult for it ever to be released. As tragic as it was, this certainly made it a lot easier to care for the cub. They could feed it with a bottle and keep it in their house to raise it. Jim and Susan got really attached to this cub. They even named it after Jim. Jimbo the bear quickly imprinted on the family. Despite trying to keep some distance, Jimbo accepted them as his family and tried to go wherever they did. He was especially attached to Jim. The bear loved them just as much as they loved him. He might have been small when they got him, but when he started growing, it seemed as if he wouldn't stop. Kodiak bears are one of the biggest bear species in the world, and Jimbo was one of the huge ones. With adult male Kodiak bears weighing between 900 and 1,500 pounds, 408 to 680 kilograms, or even more on average, Jimbo fit right into that range. By the time he was an adult, he weighed a whopping 1,400 pounds, or 635 kilograms. That is massive. He was the largest bear in the sanctuary by far, but the bear did not realize he was getting that big. Even as he grew, he still thought he could cuddle with the humans. He even enjoyed interacting with the occasional human visitor to Susan and Jim's home. Fortunately, such interactions were not frequent. Jim and Susan had a clear vision for their sanctuary, quickly expanding to house several bears and a variety of other animals. While many sanctuaries enlist additional help, that wasn't the case at the Orphaned Wildlife Center. Jim and Susan intended to manage everything themselves, remaining the sole caregivers for the animals to this day. Although they later brought in assistance for administrative tasks, bookkeeping, and social media, when it comes to the animals, the couple continues to provide care independently. Visitors are not permitted at the center. It's not a zoo, but rather the home of the animals and Jim and Susan. The emphasis is on minimizing interaction with the bears, as they are not treated as pets. Even those unable to return to the wild aren't considered pets. Despite Jimbo's fondness for people, he is limited to interaction with only the couple and his medical team. Jimbo got a lot of physiotherapy to help with his leg injury. They worked with him to make sure he wasn't in a lot of pain, but sadly, he would never heal completely. Every time it got cold, he would have a painful and stiff leg, but most of the time, it didn't hold him back. He could play and swim just like any other bear. The only thing he couldn't continue was to keep living under one roof with Jim and Susan. He was getting way too big for their house, and he was destroying it. It was time to get him more space. They needed to move him into one of the enclosures on their land. They wanted him to have a friend too, and that was when they moved him into an enclosure with another bear called Leo. The two of them were fast friends. The couple started to limit their interaction with the bear, but that didn't work. Suddenly, Jimbo went from a happy, lively bear to a depressed animal who just sat in a corner of the enclosure, uninterested to play. Jim and Susan even tried feeding him his favorite food, but he had no interest in eating. They had to come up with something fast because this was not working. The bear needed to be handled in a different way than some of the others that they had cared for. They had to make another plan. But before they could think of something, Jimbo, the bear cub that Jim had rescued 20 years ago, did something incredible. One day, when it was feeding time, the giant bear came towards Jim, his front paws stretched out. Keep in mind that this was a massive 1,400-pound bear. He waddled straight towards Jim and grabbed him, enclosing Jim with his paws. To any outsider, this unusual sight would seem shocking and terrifying. But instead of screaming for help or trying to get away from Jimbo, Jim did the completely opposite and wrapped his arms around Jimbo too. The two were locked in what could only be described as an enormous bear hug, a display of an extraordinary bond between man and bear. All this depressed bear needed was a loving hug, and he would get many more for the years to come. Their bond would become even more important not long after. At 22 years old, Jimbo got sick. He was weak and couldn't do as much as he was used to, but he wasn't alone. Jimbo had his human family to get him through the tough times. When Jimbo initially went into his enclosure all those years ago, the couple tried to help him adapt, but he just kept getting more depressed. Jim and Susan gave in eventually, and they interacted with Jimbo a lot more than they did with some of the other bears. He lived in his enclosure, but he came out to spend time with them too. Despite being as big as he was and getting older, he still just wanted them to love him, and they were happy to do that. All the other bears would get shy in the few cases when people besides Jim and Susan came for a visit at the New York State Sanctuary. But Jimbo never got shy. He adored people, and when people went to check out the land, he was happy to get more attention. After Jimbo got sick, he didn't want to eat or play. He just wanted some special attention from Jim. For as long as Jimbo was sick, he wanted the couple to cuddle him all the time. They were really worried about the large bear, and Jim and Susan ensured they spent as much time with him as they could, while caring for their other animals. Slowly, he started getting better, and he healed up. He got back to playing, but he was never completely the same. Even after he got better, he remained weak and got tired a lot quicker than normal. He spent a lot more time napping than playing as he would have in the past. The only thing that really got him excited was going for a walk with Jim or Susan. Jimbo received a lot of love, and he would become an example of the importance of loving those around you in the time you have them. At 23, Jimbo got sick again. This time, he had cancer, and they found out quickly that it was terminal. It wasn't the outcome they hoped for, but as sad as his ending was, and as much as it broke Jim and Susan's hearts, it wasn't all tragic. Jimbo was lucky to have lived a life filled with love and the couple's special care for him. And in the end, they made sure he was never scared or alone. In his honor, they would continue to take the best care of bears and other animals they would rescue in the future. Bears like Jimbo and many others wouldn't have a chance without people like Jim and Susan, who dedicate their entire lives to caring for animals in need. What an incredible story! How would you react to a full-size bear wrapping its arms around you? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Join us again for even more incredible stories.